So I'm here today with Brad McGuinness, and we're going to talk about, his lifelong fascination with aviation and his recent purchase here of this beautiful Stearman. Brad, how did you get started in aviation?
I got started in aviation through my dad.
Yeah?
My dad was a lifelong employee of American Electric Power, and he loved flying. He started out early on in his, I'm going to say in his flying career.
Yeah.
As a kid, he would, throughout the county fairs, from year to year, would take with his wagon 5-gallon cans of gas to the barnstormers that came in for the county fairs and hold rides. And his reward at the end of the day was he got a ride in, at that point in time, I think it was a Waco that they were flying. But I think he was 12 when he first got his first ride. Fortunately for me, I was 2 weeks old when I got my first ride. Mm-hmm. And so I picked it up from him, and it's been a lifelong thing for me. It was one of those things growing up. I always said if I was going to spend any time with my dad, it was either at the airport or it was in the garage working on cars. And I enjoy the airport a lot more than working on cars.
I can relate to that story.
Right, I understand.
So did your dad ever fly commercially at all?
The only time that he ever flew commercially was after he retired. He retired when he was 60 years old from AP, and we had a flight department at the time, and we had a couple Saberliners, a 100 King Air, 55 Baron, A36, and I had always wanted him, way back when, I had always wanted him to fly with me. And I was running the flight department at the time, and I said, I'd really like for you to, if you're willing, and Mom will let you, come fly with us for a while. And he started out taking a trip every now and then to the point where he started flying on a regular basis, almost more so than I did. That lasted for about 2 years, and then finally Mom looked at him and said 2 years is enough. At 62, he officially retired completely.
Well, I think one of the more interesting stories I heard about your dad is, let's talk about his ag aviation experiences.
Okay, so again, as a longtime employee of American Electric Power, he started out in the ag business, crop dusting early on in the day when they were using Stearmans to crop dust as well as Super Cubs.
Yep.
And this was before Piper, I think, made one of the first ag airplanes. It was called a Piper Pawnee, and yet prior to that, the Stearman was a big dusting machine as well as the Super Cub, and so he flew primarily the Super Cub, and they would take the back seat out of the Cub. They put a 500-gallon hopper in it. As I recall, he used to say every time they would go out and dump a load, or spray a load, I should say, that they'd put 4 gallons of gas on the airplane, and that was it. That was the extent of it. So every time, and unfortunately, fortunately or unfortunately, the Super Cub had wing tanks in it rather than one center fuselage tank, and so you'd put 2 gallons in the right wing and 2 gallons in the left wing, which wouldn't take you very far, but you didn't go very far anyways. Mm-hmm. And he had one summer, I'm going to say 4 or 5 years maybe into his crop dusting career, he had 3 friends that were killed in the Super Cubs as a result of not catching the fuel just right, okay, on the climb out, and the airplane, and they couldn't get to either they didn't or didn't get to the fuel valve quick enough, and literally he had 3 of his friends killed in the Super Cub, and at that point my mom said it's time to do something else other than crop dust. But he used to spend the majority of, and he always used to say he used to do it because we needed the money. He enjoyed doing it because he loved to fly, and so that's unfortunately for me, my passion for aviation. I came by it honestly, and that was, again, the apple didn't fall far from the tree there.
I think it's a great story. So when did you start flying yourself, Brad?
As far as flying the airplane is concerned, I told you I took my first airplane ride when I was 2 weeks old. And my dad, back in the day, he used to do a lot. This was back in the Cessna 1. There was no such thing as a Cessna 150 yet. No. It was either the Cessna 120 or the Cessna 140. the Piper Cubs, the Piper Vagabonds, the Champs, and all that kind of stuff. So that was kind of when, as I was growing up through aviation, those were the airplanes that I remember flying. And Dad was also a flight instructor, so here again on the weekends, because we needed the money, when he quit crop dusting, he would flight instruct. And back in the day, the government used to have what they call a GI Bill. And the GI Bill would, if you're in the military, you served for so long, they would, there were funds available for. So he taught a lot of GI pilots to fly. Early on, and so when I started out, of all things, and I could tell you story after story, but I could never see over the glare shield, but he taught me how to fly by instrument. And so it's one of those things where, of course, I couldn't touch the rudder pedals until I got tall enough, and then he would put cushions behind me to slide me forward. And I'll never forget a day we took off out of Findlay in a 310 one day, and it was snowing like crazy, and I always wanted to fly. If I was sitting in the front seat, there were a lot of times I had to sit in the back seat because he would take me along, flight instructing and things like that. But there were a lot of times that if we were relocating an airplane someplace, I got to sit up front. And when I sat up front, it was always, let me fly, Dad, let me fly. And I didn't know what I didn't know. He always told the story, and I remember the day to this day. We took off in a blinding snowstorm, and I said, let me fly. And he thought about it for a while, and he said, he probably flies better on instruments than I do. And he said, okay, go ahead and fly. And I flew the airplane from the right seat. I was oblivious to the outside surroundings, but I flew by the instruments, and I'm going to say I was maybe 5 or 6 years old at the time. But it was just, that was, again, flying in those days, it was a completely different world altogether. And that's how I'm going to say I first started learning. So every opportunity that I got, naturally, it was either from the right seat or from the left seat. And so I remember at one point in time when I was in the 6th grade, I had more, I told you this story before, I had more time logged in a Twin Bonanza when I was in the 6th grade than any other airplane that I had flown since prior to that. So going through, I'm going to say grade school, high school, I'll never forget my dad always used to bring projects home. It was either a car that, he'd bring home for my brother and I to clean on, or he'd bring an airplane home that needed some cosmetic stuff or whatever, and hey, come on, let me show you what I bought, and blah, blah, blah. So
that was a family affair. Your mom got involved in that too,
She got involved in it, he got involved in it, my brother got involved in it. And so, depending on what he decided to bring home. So one day, he goes out and he says, hey, you're never going to believe what I bought. I bought a Luscombe. And it was an 8A, 65 horse motor in it, no electrical system. It had heel brakes, not toe brakes, but it had heel brakes on the pilot side and no brakes at all on the co-pilot side. And of all things, it was pink and black.
Oh, wow.
Overall pink with a black stripe. 1167 kilo.
Hot pink or light pink?
Well, it was kind of a light pink. It wasn't a hot pink. Okay, I probably wouldn't have been able to fly if it was a hot pink, but it was a light pink. And so he said, this is the airplane that you're going to fly. And I said, okay. And he said, I'll just tell you this. He said, I've flown it, and he'd flown just about everything that had wings on it at the time. And my dad was one of those that if it had wings and somebody needed an airplane moves, he would go fly it. And because he just loved to fly. And so with this Luscombe, he said, if you can fly this airplane, I'll never forget this, because he said, if you can fly this airplane, there isn't a tail dragger around that you can't fly. And this is way before, I'd ever flown, anything, well, like Twin Beach or, like the Stagger Wing or anything like that, anything big, so to speak. I mean, the Luscombe it was a real close coupled airplane that it would humble you real quick, like if you weren't careful. So I started out flying the thing from the right seat because we only had one set of brakes, and that was on the left side. And there was a day when He said, okay. He said, I'm not really okay with doing this, but there comes a point in time when you're going to have to fly this airplane. And so we swapped seats, fired the thing up, and I got the thing about, I don't know, maybe 30 or 40 feet down the runway, or the taxiway, and I was from one side to the other. And I had flown, prior to then, I'd flown all kinds of different airplanes, but I'm not going to say I didn't like the Luscombe, but it wasn't one of my favorite airplanes. And again, it didn't have an electrical system, and so I got about 5 or 6 S-turns that I didn't want to make, and I thought, this is ridiculous. And I stopped on the ramp, I reached up and I turned the megs off, and I said, you know what, if I have to fly this, then I think I'm going to quit flying.
Yeah.
And so there was dead silence in the cockpit for a while, and he said, okay, if that's what you want to do, then I understand. And he left it go at that. And I'm one of these, I don't quit on anything. You know what I mean? And so it was one of those things where I guess I was more upset with myself than I was him, because as I sat there for a minute, and it seemed like we sat there for an hour, and it probably wasn't 2 or 3 minutes. But we sat there for a little bit, and I kind of, thought about it, and I thought, okay, there's no way that I'm going to let this thing, get me. I'm going to master this airplane. And so I'm going to say I probably flew that airplane for a couple hundred hours, something like that. And to this day, and I'm not gloating or bragging, but I keep going back to, I've never found a tail dragger that I couldn't fly. And he said it best. He said, if you can fly this airplane, you can fly any of them. And so that was a real humbling learning experience for me. But it's one of those life stories I'll never forget about.
It's a great story, Brad. So kind of fast forward a little bit further on, I mean, you've had a lot of airplanes in life. How did you go from here? What was your first commercial airplane job? How did you get moving from this point?
So I had of all things, I had a gentleman that was in the scrap iron and metal business, and we grew up in Northwest Ohio, and he was like a grandfather to us.
Yep.
And he didn't have any kids. He wanted somebody to take over the scrap iron and metal business. He had talked to my dad. My dad wasn't interested because he was too busy working for AEP and flying. So he talked to my brother. My brother wasn't interested, so he came and talked to me. And that back in the day was, I'm going to say, kind of how the Hebrews did it. And he was the eldest of 3 sons, so he inherited the family business. And like I said, he was literally like a grandfather to us. And so I opted to. He called one day, and I had just getting ready. I had received the tennis scholarship. I was getting ready to start my freshman year. He called and he said, "Hey," he said, "I'd really like to talk to you if you're interested." And I went and talked to him, and at that point in time, they had a K-Model Bonanza and a Beech 55 Baron. I had maybe, I'm going to say, 1,200 hours at that point in the game. And he said, I'd like for you to think about coming to, maybe one of these days take over the business and blah, blah, blah. And the thing that was really kind of cool about that, Matt, was he used and he told me this. He said, I know you're getting ready to go to college. I understand that. If you want to go, that's great. But he said, if you're going to do that, then I don't really have an interest in you. And I said, really? And he was really old school.
Yeah.
And his family came over on the boat, and they started out with a fruit business, of all things, produce. And his job, he always used to say when he was little, was polishing apples. He polished apples every day. That's what he did. But ultimately, had this scrap business. And the thing that was really neat about that one, when I said sure, I'll give it a whirl, everything business related that he taught me was, of all things, associated with flying, because he too loved flying. And when I first went there, I had a private pilot's license, and he called me into his office one day, and he said, you've been here for 6 months. and I just want you to know you're going to have to get an instrument rating. I said, and I had, done some preliminary work, and I said, okay, so how do I go about that? He said, okay, so here's what you're going to do. He said, every Monday, Wednesday, and Fridays, you're going to take your lunch hour and you're going to go out here to the airport. And I've already made arrangements with, and they were a beach dealer, so they had a beach sundowner. He said, I've already made arrangements with them. He said, I'm taking care of all your flying, and here's the caveat. Until you get an instrument rating, you won't get a pay increase. So it was all centered around, and then he went into talking about business and talking about instrument flying. And you have to stay ahead of the game. You have to stay ahead of business. You can't wait for things to happen. You have to look through things. You have to be in a position of where you think down the road, or you'll get yourself killed. And so it was one of those things where, and everything, I'm not going to say everything I did, but so many of the learning experiences from him were aviation related. So that was kind of a neat, from a career standpoint. Now I very quickly got an instrument rating, and from there, I'll never forget, because I needed 1,500 hours total time before I could fly the Baron. And he and I would go out and fly, and I didn't have the 1,500 hours, but I would fly left seat, and he'd say, hey, I'm pilot in command, but I want you to fly in the left seat, and blah, blah, blah. And so I don't know how many Baron hours I had by the time I got 1,500, but I had a bunch. And so it was one of those, okay, you got your 1,500 hours, and now you can go fly the Baron. So prior to that, I was flying we had a K model Bonanza. The FBO had an S model I flew. I think I was 22 years old at that point in time, because, an S model Bonanza was a pretty fast little airplane at the time. And at 22, I thought I was right up there with, with getting down with the program, because, that was a pretty fast little airplane. And so from there, I'm going to say I worked in his business for just under 10 years. And then in 1980, my dad, with Kentucky Power at the time, or part of the American Electric Power System, introduced me to a guy by the name of Tom Wright, who I went to work for. He was looking to buy an airplane. Of all things, he wanted to buy a 58 Baron, and I had a fair amount of time in the 55.
And what business line was Tom in?
That was industrial cleaning.
Okay.
We were. I say industrial cleaning. It was truly industrial cleaning, an industry where we had high pressure water cleaning equipment, we had vacuum equipment, we were in the asbestos abatement business, we were in the chem waste disposal business. We were in a lot of things at the time.
I think business and the aviation tie together is another important part of this story, because so many of us are in aviation or in business, and really we're in business before we can afford airplanes.
Well, and that was the thing I will have to say, when we first got started, and it was I'm not going to say it was unique, because, and I keep going back to this, every scenario has a story. And so we started out with this little 58 Baron, and we fell kind of on hard times a little bit. And so he came to me. I hadn't worked there 6 months. Of course, I'd had it by that time. I had 10 years in a business background, so I was okay with him. He said, hey, we got to sell the Baron. I don't know how long it'll be, but we're going to buy another airplane. Trust me. But he said, I want you to be involved in the business. So I literally was running one of the I'm going to say the local business that he had there in the Ashland area at the time. And he said, but just bear with me. He said, we'll get another airplane. That didn't last 6 months. And he came in one day and he said, hey, we're okay now. We got everything squared away. Let's look around and see if we can find a Navajo. So we went from the Baron to the Navajo. From there, shortly after that, we bought a C model Cessna 421. We had the Cessna 421 for a while, and then we bought a King Air. We kept the 421, had the King Air. We went from the King Air into a Citation. In the King Air, we sold the King Air and bought a Saberliner, and it just elevated from there. So, my career through aviation, running the flight department, then by that time, well, when we ultimately he sold the business, we had 2 Saberliners, a 100 King Air, a 55 Baron, and an A-36, and several pilots and so on and so forth. So that was above and beyond me running the flight department, which was a fun thing because I got to fly a bunch. I was also involved in the business, which kind of led me to eventually started my own business in 1995.
And that was industrial cleaning also,
That was
Brad?
industrial cleaning as well. So I've been in the service business since 1980. You know, serving, period, serving. And so the thing that was really nice about that day and time from 1980 to 1991, Tom was also a pilot. He liked aviation, liked to fly. And so we were coming back from Florida one evening, and he walked up into the cockpit and he said, "If you were going to buy an old airplane, what would you buy?" And I didn't bat an eye. I just very quickly said I'd buy a Staggerwing Beach. And right back he came at me and he said, "Let's see if we can't find one." So we found one within a week. And that was, I'm going to say, the first old airplane that we bought. After that, we had a couple Stearmans, T-28, L-39, and so it just kind of snowballed from there over the years. And quite honestly, we used to use, you know, kind of aviation as a benchmark to sit back and say, okay, well, once we achieve a certain revenue size, we can have this. Well, once we achieve a certain revenue size, now we can have two of those. And once we receive, so ultimately it was one of those things when I got out of the business, he sold his business in 1991 to Waste Management. I got back into the business, the industrial clean business, in 1995, and kind of used the same benchmark.
So I think another part of your story is, tell us how you utilize the airplanes in business.
So we had a 60 model Sabre early on that we used to haul crews all over the country. Mm-hmm. And that was primarily and of all things, at that point in time, the customer would pay for that. So that was a great thing because we got great utilization out of the airplane, and the customer was paying the bill.
And you got to fly it, right?
And I got to fly it.
Sounds like a win-win.
Right. That was definitely a win-win. So, you know, and then it was we had a 100 King Air that we had 13 different office locations, and we had a 100 King Air set up to where we were going someplace almost every day to one of the locations. And so, you know, the 100 King Air was like a 200 only, you know, it was an earlier model. So it had 10 seats in it, and we tried to fill as many seats up as we could by going to the different locations. So that was one of those things too. By that time, out of the 13 locations, I think I had 6 in the flight department, and it was actually Tom's brother that had 6 locations as well. So we were constantly using the 100 King Air too as well. And so the Sabreliner was used more for weekend work. The 100 King Air was used during the week, and then the 65 Sabre was kind of Tom's airplane. Mm-hmm. So we just had all kinds of stuff to fly, and it was really a lot of fun. So like I said, from there, we kind of moved in 1995 when I started the business. We just, you know, I've continued that passion for aviation, and it's just kind of snowballed from there.
So Brad, how many Stearmans have you had?
Well, I've had 2 in the business. We had 2, so I've been involved with 4 over the years. And way back in the day when and I always tell the story, and you know, people kind of get tired of hearing the story because I'm so passionate about old airplanes and mostly World War II stuff. But you know, we used Dad here again by crop dusting in one of these. Of course, they took these and they put a different engine in them. They put a, you know, 985 Pratt Whitney 450 horse engine on them, and really made quite a machine out of these things for crop dusting. So he loved the Stearman, and so there were a few back in the day, friends of his that had them. He had one early on, and it was one of those things where we would go to different air shows and things like that, and you know, there was always somebody out of the military in the Second World War. When I was born, the World War II had been over with for 8 years. Mm-hmm. So by the time I was 10 years old, which was 18 years later, there are still pilots in the Second World War that by that time, I'm going to say they were about 40 years old, 42 years old, still young. And general aviation has changed a lot since back in the day.
Not for the better either.
You can know, and you can relate to this. I mean, it used to be back in the day that, you know, that you'd go to the airport if you didn't have anything to fly, even if you didn't have an airplane. you just go hang out because somebody had an airplane. If you wanted to go fly someplace, they said, come on, let's load up the airplane, let's go have that $100 hamburger. Listening to the stories of these guys that flew B-17s, P-51s, B-24s, and as I would hang out with the Stearmans back in the day, we would go to the air shows and stuff, you'd always have somebody that would come walking up to one of these and say, I got my wings in this airplane. I flew. It didn't make any difference if it was the Stearman. They had other airplanes of all things back in the day. There were guys that went and that got their wings in Cubs, J3 Cubs. There were guys that the PT, what was it? The PT-19, I believe it was another one, the initial trainer. But the majority, Boeing built 10,000 of these things, and they either went to the Navy or to the Army, and that's what a lot of the guys got their wings in. So there would always be somebody that come walking up and say, you know what, this is my first trainer that I learned to fly in, and from there I went to blah blah blah, and from there I went to blah blah blah. And the thing that I've seen in my time, which is really tragic, I've seen those guys that were in their 40s to when, and I still go to air shows, and take the airplanes there. But it used to be, this is what I learned to fly in, to this is what my dad learned to fly in, and now it's kids coming up, younger people coming up, and they'll have their grandfather's wings, they'll have their grandfather's logbook, or they'll have something, and they'll say, you know what, look, my grandfather this is what he got his initial training in, was one of these airplanes right here. And they'll walk over and they'll touch the airplane, or they'll do something like that to try to connect, just have some kind of connection, to what goes on. And that's really tragic, because I've seen now 3 generations of people that come up and do that, just to say, at first it was I did this, and then my dad did this, and then my grandfather used to fly, and it's been almost 80 years.
Things are different now. I grew up in a family airport, and my dad would have to chase people away.
Right.
And now me, and people think I'm young in aviation. I'm almost 50 years old. We just opened an FBO at a small local town airport, and one of my biggest disappointments is nobody's coming to hang out. I've got free coffee and sodas in the fridge.
Right.
I'm very open, and the atmosphere is not the same as it used to be, even as inviting as I try to be with the situation.
Right.
And I wish more people would come by.
And absolutely, 1,000%. It's one of those things where, here again, coming from the northwestern part of the state of Ohio, we're out there, you can't find a hill anywhere. To northeastern Kentucky, where it's all hills. And ever since I was just a little fella growing up around, my dad, here again, back in his day, they used to have what they called flying farmers. I don't know if you've ever heard of flying farmers or not.
Yeah.
The flying farmers back in the day, what they would do is literally they would go out and they would cut down a bean field. Okay, after they got the bean field cut down, they'd make a strip there, and these different farmers, and there used to be a fair amount of farmers back in the day that had airplanes, on their farm, just like here. And they'd fly someplace, they'd fly 10 or 15 miles away, and they would just make a day out of it.
Sounds beautiful. We just cut hay at my pasture. You know what I'm going to do next week? Land into the pasture.
Right, and that's exactly what happened. So it was one of those things where, it still goes back to that, the dynamic of aviation, where it has changed so much, is so much anymore, the people, you'll see people come to the FBO, but they'll come in long enough to jump on an airplane, take off and go. And the thing that, ever since I was this tall, I always wanted a farm that I could have a grass runway on, a farm that I could have my own hangar on, and one of those type of things. And it's been a childhood dream of mine, a bucket list thing, so to speak. And I've had this now for 7 years. And when I first bought the first piece of property over here, I had enough property to put an 1,800-foot landing strip on. There's hills on either end, but 1,800 feet for this airplane, it isn't much. I mean, you can do fine with 1,800 feet in this airplane, even coming in over hills. But I had the runway here, and everybody that I flew with was afraid to come out here and land because it was too short because of the hills. So then I bought more of the farm, the family farm, the old family farm, and I put a 3,000-foot runway in here, thinking, okay, I'm gonna get more of my friends that come out here now, that have smaller airplanes. And I got 2 buddies that have, in the last I'm going to say 4 years since I've got the long runway, as I call it, done. They come out every once in a while and just shoot the breeze for a while, and then they take off and go. And
Things are different now across the board.
Very much so, and it's disappointing, but
I really enjoyed coming in here, and I'd like to say I flew this thing for 14 hours plus from Texas to the border of Kentucky and West Virginia. And I've been in an open cockpit biplane for an hour or two at a time, but nothing like the experience I just had. I really saw America.